really provocative to sort of test their reflexes, like having a fake kid, or a picture of a kid leap out suddenly from the highway and see if they run him over or not. That would be dangerous to the extreme. So I think the IRB would have said ixnay on that.
Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am by when we will all be back in the studio. Chris, I'm going to rely on your medical expertise here. When do you think we are all we'll be able to record our first studio-based episode again?
I think by 2025.
2025. I mean, it feels a little optimistic to me, but I'm going to hold out hope. Well, I am Matt Fox from the Departments of Epidemiology and Global Health at the Boston University School of Public Health, and I am joined once again by Dr. Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health. Welcome, Chris.
Hello.
And we are also here with Dr. Jess Liebler from the Department of Environmental Health. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And as a reminder, as always, if you could head over to the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. That's BU's hub for lifelong learning. Lots of interesting stuff over there. And then when you're on that internet anyway, you might as well head over to iTunes or Stitcher or whatever your favorite podcast app is and give us a rating, and a review would be even better. We love them. And if you do a good one, we will read it on the air.
We want at least 1 star.
At least, well, obviously. We don't want 0 stars. So now onto the show. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we're going to look at a study on cannabis and driving performance. Might not be quite as simple as that, but then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we'll talk about how much excess mortality there has been this past year in relation to COVID. And then our amazing and amusing, we will get into some things that make us laugh out loud, or Jess will tell us about her newest favorite animal.
Can't wait.
So let's get into segment 1. So we're going to talk about an article that looked at the impact of cannabis use on driving, sort of. It was published in JAMA, and the study was entitled The Effect of Cannabidiol. Is that how you pronounce it? Cannabidiol?
I think we're going to have to rely on Chris. I don't know.
I think that's right.
And
tetrahydrocannabinol
on driving performance. Oof, stumbled through that one. A randomized clinical trial by first author Thomas Arkwell of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics of the University of Sydney in Australia. So there are a bunch of headlines on this one. So Yahoo News says, drivers using medicinal cannabis safe. I'm not sure that's exactly the right...
I don't think that's what they said.
No, I don't think so. CBD
That's not what they said in this study at all. Where did that come from?
CBD doesn't impair driving ability, according to landmark study, says Vice.
That's not what they said either.
CBD-only cannabis doesn't appear to affect driving ability, unlike THC, Business Insider says. That one's a little bit more accurate. Does CBD impair driving ability? Study finds no evidence cannabis-derived CBD impairs driving, says Forbes. So
that's not what they said either.
These ones were a little bit unclear. So, Jess, can you tell us what they did in this study, and then we can talk about whether the headlines do or do not make any sense?
Yeah, this was certainly an interesting one. So I actually enjoyed reading it. So if any of our listeners are interested in a good article, this was a fun one and kind of interesting and good to read. So obviously, the kind of big picture here is that there's evidence to suggest that cannabis consumption at higher doses causes car accidents. And so this is kind of the framing of this article, especially as there's been greater access to medical marijuana and recreational marijuana across many states, including ours in Massachusetts. Kind of what is potential consequences for lower use dosage for car safety? One of Chris's favorite topics, traffic safety. How does this play into recreational use of cannabis? So anyway, what these researchers did is actually kind of a fairly nuanced and interesting study. And also just one more sec to back up, because I'm not familiar, so I'm going to do my best here. But they look at 2 different types of cannabis, kind of two different varieties. THC, used for intoxication primarily as a recreational drug. CBD, they're focused on as a medical treatment.
two different compounds within cannabis. Yeah.
Okay, so this is where I don't know the difference. So I'll rely on the two of you. So THC, they're making a distinction between THC used for intoxication or recreational use, CBD they're saying used for medical treatment, and then a combination of CBD and THC that could be used for recreation for milder intoxication. Okay, so they're talking specifically about these three variants of cannabis in this article. So this is a randomized case crossover trial to consider the effect of vaping as the exposure medium. So vaping CBD, THC, and combination CBD and THC on driving abilities. Okay, and their endpoint is this very subtle mechanism. They're not looking at car accident or car crashes. It's the standard deviation of lateral position, and they use the acronym SDLP, which is a fancy way of looking at lane weaving. And so they were measuring this in this trial on the basis of centimeters, which I find really kind of intriguing. So this is a very subtle outcome of driving performance. Okay, and there were 26 people in this study. So this is a small study, but you'll see this was time and labor intensive. 26 people in this study. 16 of them were women. Most of them were women. The mean age was 23 years, and these were casual users of cannabis products. Okay, they were not intense users, not medical users, but casual users of recreational cannabis. And so what they did. Each of the people in these study participated in 8 separate driving tests under 4 different conditions. The first was placebo. The second one was THC only. The third was CBD only. And the fourth was a mix of THC and CBD vaped. Okay, so they would vape these 4 concoctions, okay, on 4 separate occasions. And then at 40 minutes after vaping, they did a 1-hour road test, okay? And then they did a second 1-hour road test at 240 minutes after vaping. So there were these 4 experimental conditions for each study participant, and then each study participant under each of these 4 experimental conditions had 2 1-hour driving tests where they were primarily looking at lane weaving as the core outcome, okay? And so this was like taking an on-the-road test, and I was actually just a couple of weeks ago with my husband, we were talking with our older daughters about the on-the-road test and what to expect, and this was the same sort of thing where they had someone next to them who could control the car if the study participant couldn't do it anymore. They also looked at some psychomotor and cognitive outcomes, the most interesting one maybe which was perception of ability to drive, kind of playing into if, this question of if someone had vaped, would they recognize that maybe they shouldn't get behind the wheel? So anyway, so their core outcomes after doing all of these different tests, in the shorter time period, at 40 minutes to 100 minutes after vaping, this SDLP lane weaving measurement was significantly increased within the THC group and the THC-CBD combination group, but not with CBD alone compared to placebo. Okay, so what this is implying is that people who were vaping THC, either alone or in combination with CBD, had more lane weaving than people who were vaping CBD alone or were just vaping a placebo at the time point closer to the point of vaping. So at the 40 minutes to 100 minutes in that first road test. And they did not differ at their second road test, which was 240 minutes after the vaping. Okay, so it was indicative of short-term driving impairment associated with THC. And the authors said that it was similar to what's observed with a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. I don't know where that comparison came from, but that's what they were claiming. And there were some interesting observations in terms of when the participants were aware, or whether they were aware, or when they were aware of their impairment. And it seems that the participants who vaped THC were aware of their impairment by the later time point, but not so much at the earlier time point, which maybe would have played into their decision to drive or not to drive. But that kind of later on, they were aware that they were experiencing some sort of impairment. There were no differences in the cognitive tests on the basis of the interventions. So anyway, that's the rundown.
Okay, so essentially a randomized, you mentioned it was a crossover design, so meaning you would have people using all of these different substances at different times, which is very strong design in that you can control for a lot of the time-fixed confounding factors. Not a very large study, only 26, of which only 22 actually completed the study, and seems to be an indication that the cannabis that was mostly dominantly THC-based or mixed was potentially harmful. Seemingly not a lot of evidence that the CBD-dominant strains were particularly harmful. Chris, what was your take on the study?
Yeah, so I thought it was a really fascinating design. I think that the sample size was unfortunately far too small to really measure a lot of the outcomes that they were looking at, because while what Jess said is true, that there was no statistically significant difference between, in terms of the confidence in driving ability or the perceived driving impairment, the confidence intervals were super wide on this. And if you just look at the point estimates, there really does seem to be quite a striking difference, actually, that the people who had been exposed to the THC were far less confident in their ability to drive, and also early on perceived a much higher degree of driving impairment. But that the confidence intervals around those point estimates were wide, and so technically that's true. But I think it's not actually true. I think this is just a matter of the fact that they only had 26 people in the study.
Okay, so Chris, I see what you're saying is that there was, in this perceived impairment, there was actually a difference. It's just that the confidence intervals were so wide that you didn't find a statistically significant difference. There was no statistical difference for those who had CBD dominant strain in terms of their driving, but in terms of the perception there was, is what you're saying.
That's right. But if you take the point estimates as being the most likely true value in each of these cases, there are some other parts of these data that are really pretty interesting. Sort of starting with this whole question about cannabidiol and what does it do. So to my knowledge, the only thing that cannabidiol has been authorized to do as a treatment is as a therapy for several rare forms of epilepsy. And there's actually an FDA-approved indication for that. And there's a marketed form of cannabidiol that's been standardized and is used to treat those forms of epilepsy. But for the rest, what we understand about cannabidiol, CBD, is pretty limited. It's generally assumed that cannabidiol is not intoxicating in the way that THC is. But beyond that, I think, we're still at a pretty early stage in the research and understanding the pharmacology of this compound and what it would be used for. So with that said, it's sort of interesting that when you look at the confidence to drive score at 0 minutes, which is right after they finished vaping, and 25 minutes and 130 minutes going up to 200 minutes, that there is this sort of decline in the confidence to drive, particularly amongst the THC-only group. But in the THC and the CBD combined group, where they received the same total number of milligrams of THC in both, right? So it's not like they had half THC, half cannabidiol, but they'd cut the dose in half to make it. They actually gave them the same dose that was in the cannabidiol only group and the THC only group. So they got both of them at full strength. And the confidence to drive scores are much lower for the THC only group than the THC CBD group. And that effect persists out to, really 130 minutes where there seems to be that difference, kind of implying that the CBD is to some degree counteracting the effect of the THC itself, which is not a totally crazy hypothesis, because it's been proposed in pharmacology that THC receptors may be blocked by cannabidiol. So it's not that cannabidiol makes you feel high, but it may be that it decreases the effect of THC because it's competing for the same receptors, even if it's not activating those receptors. So I think there's sort of interesting pharmacology in this graph. But, putting that all aside, we were sort of puzzled by what is the I guess I don't know if I can say clinical relevance, but the public health relevance of a 2.9 centimeter deviation. In the paper, they say that this is analogous to a blood alcohol level of 0.05, which at least in the state of Utah is considered to be the legal limit for alcohol in order to drive a car. So technically, in Utah, this means that you're drunk. So the 2.9 is I guess I would infer is not a negligible difference in driving skill, as was implied in those media clips we heard at the beginning. But this is actually, somewhat to, legally intoxicated. And so therefore it is a significant loss of driving function, primarily due to THC and to a lesser degree, the THC CBD combo.
So I would agree with you, Chris, though I would say that the headlines were, except for the first one, which was driving using medicinal cannabis safe, which is clearly wrong. The other one's focused on CBD. The CBD doesn't impair driving ability, and that, again, I take your point that there is some impact on some of the subjective measures, but on the more objective measure, it doesn't seem like there was. Jess, what was your take on this study?
One of the interesting things to me in this study was that the participants, in addition to the very small sample size, the participants were all very young. They were in their early 20s. And that could speak to that being the population of greatest relevance for generalizability in terms of who might be vaping cannabis products and then driving, but it also reflected a population where they're most likely to have the sharpest reflexes for driving. It could go in a number of ways. You could say that these very young participants were likely to have sharpest reflexes and maybe able best to counteract any effects of cannabis in terms of their driving, but they also might be less experienced drivers than, someone in their 40s or 50s who was vaping, for example. Might have slower reflexes, but might have more driving experience. So I was just thinking about the study population and how that relates to generalizability of the findings across users of cannabis products, and I wasn't really sure how to conclude on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, of course, there may be effect modification by driver age and experience, but of course, I certainly couldn't imagine a scenario in which we regulated your ability to drive under the influence of cannabis based on your age. So presumably there will be just some determination of how much cannabis you can have before you're considered to be legally over the limit. But I do take your point. So my thinking on this, so I thought it was an interesting study. I do think that the study design that they used was quite strong for the sample size that they were going to use, which was only 26, and strong in the sense that when you do these crossover designs, you control for a lot of the confounding that is time invariant. So, the age and sex and those things don't really change much over the time period of the study, and so those wash out, and that's really nice. You're doing a randomized trial, so you're getting the random variation in who's getting the exposure to begin with, but you also get this additional benefit of the time fixed confounding washing out. But at the end of the day, it's still only 26 people or 22 people that completed the study, and I'm not going to draw strong conclusions based on a study of 26 people ever. In addition to which, it seems to me like there is some potential for somewhat strong confounding, potentially by time invariant factors, namely being the road conditions. So if if you're out and there are a lot of, crazy people on the road, your behavior is going to be different from if you're driving on a rural road by yourself. Now presumably they're on the same roads, but the conditions may differ from time to time. The second thing is, I don't totally get the ethics of putting a person with a potentially impaired ability behind the wheel on an open road test, even given the safeguards of having the person evaluating there with an additional set of controls. Because, obviously that's going to impede or reduce the risk of an accident, but it's not going to completely eliminate it. And that just struck me as a little weird, but also, wouldn't that have the potential to reduce the amount of variation if you have another person in the car who can control the the steering wheel and presumably is going to do so whenever there is a potentially dangerous situation. I mean, presumably since they didn't report on that, it's probably not very much, but it did occur to me. No.
Mm-hmm. There were some people who opted not to participate because they were concerned about safety. And you could say maybe those people were the more skittish drivers or were the more anxious drivers in general, and so didn't want to participate for that reason. So no, I agree with you.
There were a couple things that sort of stuck out to me that I thought were really curious. One was that the average number of kilometers driven per year by these individuals was 4,500 kilometers a year, which is not a lot of driving, actually. That's about 3,000 miles a year. And I probably do, in my commute to Boston University, back in the days when I was commuting to Boston University, was probably around 16 to 18,000 miles a year. So way, way, way above this. So I would see these as being very low driving frequency drivers.
Again, which if there is effect modification by experience and
that should matter.
Age, that could factor in here, sure.
The other thing is that I'm not sure. I mean, obviously they're doing this on the highway, so they can't do anything like, really provocative to sort of test their reflexes, like having a fake kid, or a picture of a kid leap out suddenly from the highway and see if they run them over or not. That would be dangerous to the extreme. So I think the IRB would have said ixnay on that. But there are other ways of doing this, because I kind of feel like the driving test they gave them, while I understand that there's a clinical link to a degree of alcohol intoxication, they were not really giving them a very hard test, right? They had to drive on a circuit in the right, in the slow lane, going basically 60 miles an hour for an hour and do nothing else, just stick to your lane. But they weren't tasked to respond in any way to an emergency situation, or, all really they were asked to do was to drive straight. And so, saying that, their ability to drive straight, varying by only an inch or so from the placebo group, is, again, it's somewhat meaningful, but it doesn't seem like this was a very provocative test of their true driving capacity, which is not how well do people do on average when they're just driving and nothing happens, but how well do they respond to an emergency? And they didn't test that at all.
Or even how well do they respond to some sort of commotion, which could have been, something that could have been added to the study in a not too complicated way if there's all of a sudden there's noise commotion. Right. And does that affect, the ability to be able to duly focus on kind of focus on the road and block out noise, or, something of that sort, where kind of getting into the multitasking that's often required when you're in a real life driving situation, not just driving in total silence on the road when you're being monitored, but kind of something that might simulate more of a real life experience, especially maybe for these young people where they might have other people in the car, people are talking, music, something like that might replicate a more real life situation.
A cell phone, right? Being distracted by talking on the cell phone, even hands-free, I think would have been a really interesting, sort of test. I mean, this book I referenced in our last episode called Traffic talks all about the difficulty of multitasking, and that like how your reflexes when you're driving drop substantially as soon as you start talking to someone on the cell phone, even if it's just a hands-free device.
Yep. So just one thing I just want to point out before we end. So it's worth noting that if I understood it correctly, their outcome measure is a measure of standard deviation, not of the mean. So we're talking about, a variation of an inch, but that's not really an inch in average movement. That's an inch in the standard, the measure of how much variability there is. So it could be that is a more meaningful amount of movement than we truly understand. So I trust that they understood that, but it was a little confusing to me as somebody who's not in this field. Any last thoughts before we move on this one?
I guess I would love to see this experiment replicated in a more controlled way, like on a speedway.
Yep.
Where not only do they have to do, simulated highway driving for an hour, but that they were also exposed to certain, random events, like some proportion of these individuals, there would be a warning that suddenly shows up on the dashboard that says, stop, stop, stop. And they have to do an emergency stop and to track how quickly it takes them to get to 0 miles per hour.
Yep.
I think that kind of thing, or to weave or maneuver or respond to an event, something more than just do they drift a little bit more or less than they would have otherwise.
Yep.
I would like to see that.
At least some sort of variability in the course. I mean, I think you could say, it looked as if they were doing the same driving course 4 times and twice each, after each intervention. And so kind of switching, where by the time someone's getting to their 6th, 7th, 8th time around this driving course, they really know what to expect, regardless of what they've been dosed, whatever they vaped, they know what the road is going to look like. And so even just some kind of structured changes, that would be similar across all participants at that dosing level, but just to kind of provide some variability, so you kind of lose that I'm used to this effect already.
Yep, and I think that's the randomness in the order in which you had the different substances was meant to deal with some of that. But again, with only 22 subjects, it's really hard to say. All right, so I think to summarize, we thought it was an interesting study, but we'd want more data before we'd really be able to draw any strong conclusions. All right, so let's move on to our second segment, where we're going to talk about an article on the excess mortality from COVID-19. So there was an article in JAMA that was entitled All-Cause Excess Mortality and COVID-19 Related Mortality Among U.S. Adults Aged 25 to 44 Years, March to July of 2020. It was by first author Jeremy Faust, though I did want to point out that one of the authors on this was Dr. Rochelle Walensky, our friend and colleague, and soon to be new head of the CDC, assuming confirmation goes well.
Yay.
There's confirmation for the CDC, right? Or is that just an appointment?
I don't know. I think it's just an appointment.
Oh, okay. So there we go. But the reason I was interested in talking about this one is because there was so much talk at the beginning of the epidemic that maybe, since deaths were concentrated amongst those who were over the age of 65, and in particular over the age of 80, that maybe the overall mortality was not that high when you averaged across the entire population, and maybe the reason why we were seeing so much mortality was simply because it was, we were not protecting the convalescent homes and nursing homes, and, that we're just seeing excess mortality, and essentially if we just protect the elderly, we would do better. And so what they did was they compared COVID-19 deaths in the 25 to 44-year-olds with what is usually the most common cause of death in that group, which is accidental drug overdoses. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from the article. They said, between March of 2020 and July of 2020, a total of 76,000 odd all-cause deaths occurred amongst individuals 25 to 44. And that was just about 12,000 more than expected. So about 20% increased mortality in, again, those who are in a healthy, typically a low mortality age group. And then they said among that group, there were 4,535 COVID-19 deaths, accounting for 38% of measured excess mortality. So a substantial portion of that excess mortality appears to be related to COVID-19. And then they went on specifically and said during surges in particular regions in New York and New Jersey, the incident rate for all-cause mortality was 2.3%, and 80% of deaths were related to COVID-19. Similar results from a bunch of different regions. Now, these were highly hit regions, so fair enough. But then they say deaths due to COVID-19 exceeded 2018 unintentional opioid deaths during 1 month in 2020 in a bunch of different regions, and either exceeded or were similar to the highest known cause of death amongst this group over the entire study period. So the reason I'm interested in this is I'm curious your thoughts on whether we can now stop saying that COVID-19 is simply a disease of severe illness in the elderly. Now, I do want to point out that in absolute terms, clearly the amount of deaths occurring in this group is far lower than it's occurring in the 65 plus or the 80 plus. But in terms of what we would expect for mortality in these groups, where mortality is generally low, there is clearly an increase. So can we put to bed this idea that this is simply, a disease that affects the elderly?
Yeah, I really like the way you phrased that, Matt, and I totally agree, because it is making a very strong case that while in absolute terms the magnitude of this effect from COVID-19 is smaller than the elderly, it's not zero. This is actually a big deal, and by comparing it with opioid deaths, which we have already agreed as a society is a big deal, we're basically saying the magnitude of this problem is therefore significant, because
Yep.
we're it's as bad or worse than heroin overdoses in some cases. This is a big deal.
Jess, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I was interested in a few things about this. And first, a shout out to my college classmate, Jeremy Faust. So go Eve. So that's pretty cool. One of the interesting things that stuck out to me with this paper first was the power of being able to do fairly straightforward analyses with publicly available data that I think we in epidemiology tend not to do enough. Like, this data exists and we can really look at it in interesting ways and kind of draw some intriguing conclusions from data that's just out there. So I thought it was clever to do this sort of analysis. Secondly, I was interested in that line of thought involving unaccessed preventative care during the pandemic. And in terms of looking at the excess death and being able to distinguish between, for example, unidentified COVID deaths and deaths from other things that maybe would have been prevented if someone had been able to see a doctor, but they weren't able to see a doctor, but it wasn't COVID. That was what I was thinking about, is kind of that distinction between, certainly, yes, there's a proportion. So there's, 38% of the deaths are tagged to COVID. And then the remainder of the deaths are not tagged to COVID, but the hypothesis is that some of them are in fact due to COVID, but some of them are likely due to not COVID factors, but are still related to the pandemic in terms of unaccessed medical care.
COVID. Yep.
Related to the but not due to causal result from a COVID infection.
If I could add to that, we always talk about these papers about whether we believe them or we don't believe them, and I found that even though this article is 1 page long in terms of text with one table, so it's like it's as brief as you could possibly be, I was persuaded by this. And one of the most persuasive parts of this was that they look at the region by region incidence of COVID mortality by month. And in all but one of these regions, the mortality, actually in every one of these regions, the peak mortality due to COVID aligned with the peak in observed excess deaths. So it seems like to be a very strange coincidence that those two would be unrelated. So I don't know, I found that simple piece of sort of, descriptive epidemiology to be really, really profound.
I agree with you, Chris, and I think that the power here is in the fact that we could, in the early days of the pandemic, people were arguing that everything is, we're overcounting COVID deaths, and you're anyone who has a heart attack, and if they had COVID, then you're calling it a COVID death. Well, the whole point of looking at all-cause mortality is it doesn't matter. We don't have to classify the deaths one way or the other. We could just look at whether or not there is an increase in mortality, and therefore we can say whether or not the pandemic, not specifically COVID, but the pandemic, is having an effect on mortality. You could argue that some of this, as Jess says, is pandemic related, not pandemic caused directly, but rather our reaction to the pandemic could be related, and that is truly possible. But clearly there is something going on, and there was and still is. There are so many people who look at what's going on with COVID and say, well, 99.9% of 25 to 45-year-olds survive with COVID. So why are we gonna have lockdowns and things like that? It doesn't affect them. Well, when you actually look at the fact that 25 to 49-year-olds don't generally have high mortality, or 45-year-olds have high mortality, small increases lead to large or can be impactful and meaningful. And as you say, Chris, the idea that we would do nothing about, say, something like opioid deaths, which are a comparable, or suicides, is absurd. We would absolutely want to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing that I thought was interesting about this is that it just reflects that I think we're going to be dissecting the data from the pandemic for years and years and years, and kind of there's going to be interesting observations that are going to jump out. Like, maybe we'll figure out some more data and to kind of fill in some of the gaps here in terms of these excess deaths. But it was reflecting to me as I was reading this that as we're looking at this data as it's coming out, we're still just getting a piece of the big story, and it's going to take a while to really unravel all of the consequences involved with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Absolutely agree with that. Yep, it's going to be a while. All right. Well, let's move on then to our last segment, which is our amazing and amusing. Jess, why don't you go first this time?
Mine is brief, and again in my theme of animal.
All right,
from the animal kingdom. I just kind of liked this one. This was a very recent study published at the end of January in the journal Marine Mammal Science. I'm sure you both read that one regularly.
Yes, I've got my copy right here.
As it comes out, Marine Mammal Science. I think this might have been my alternate career if I had not gone into epidemiology. Maybe it would have been Marine Mammal Science. But there were some researchers who observed wild seals clapping.
Yep.
And like seal clapping is one of the activities that they train seals to do.
Yep.
In aquarium shows and whatnot, they have them do tricks. They clap their fins, they balance balls on their noses, stuff like that. Seals are obviously highly intelligent, but it was thought that clapping was just a behavior that was something that was that was just trained for reward. Right. And so there was this observation of watching animals in the wild off the coast of England, and they observed male seals only clapping both underwater and above the water. And it was when they were near other seals. And so they were trying to hypothesize what the meaning of the behavior was, and so the authors hypothesized that it either could be due to attracting mates, that like the seal that clapped the loudest maybe was able to either attract the mates or scare away competitors for the women seals, so that they thought it had some sort of reproductive effect, the clapping, which then kind of speaks to if you have seals that are in aquarium settings and they're being asked to clap all the time, like what does this mean to them, right? And does it mean anything to them? If this is actually a natural behavior that seals do in the wild, and we're asking them to reproduce it for our own amusement.
And presumably that of course makes it easier to train them to do this if they already, have
they get some dates.
Yeah.
Right, they get some dates. I mean, the next thing will be like, they'll show like you give them some beach balls and they're juggling them on their nose in the wild, and they're trying to, to also attract mates. But
it's not so very different from what we do.
That is true.
to attract mates when you get down to it. And I would reference the 1970s movie Saturday Night Fever if you want some good data on this subject.
You think that the moves that John Travolta has are very similar to seal clapping?
It's just on the end of the continuum.
Awesome, Chris. What do you got for us?
Well, I got a quickie. I was looking for elegant experiments on Google, and the first one that popped up was in the American Physics Society (APS) News, This Month in Physics History, which was published in June 2006, and it talks about the seminal experiment by the Greek. I don't know what you would call them because they weren't scientists, because that term hadn't been invented yet. So we'll say a scholar called Eratosthenes, and it was his seminal experiment to try to figure out the diameter of the Earth. And so it had been noted. First, I should say that this guy Eratosthenes was a very clever fellow who was in Ptolemaic Egypt, meaning that after Alexander the Great kind of romped through the Middle East and then died young, his generals split up the empire, and one of them, Ptolemy, went off and took over Egypt. And so that whole period of Egyptian history is called Ptolemaic Egypt, which is basically the Greeks running Egypt. And so he was a Greek living in Egypt and came from some town in Libya, apparently. But he was a polymath and eventually made his way to Alexandria, where he got trained and then was working at the Library of Alexandria. So he was what we would call a university professor, basically.
Okay.
And his nickname was Beta because he was good at many things, but not the best at any. which I thought was
like
delightful.
That. I really like that. Beta.
He was beta.
He was number 2.
At least he's not omega. So, anyway, he had heard that there was a dry well in the Egyptian city of Syene, which is now Aswan. Mm-hmm. That on the summer solstice would shine straight down without casting a shadow, meaning that the sun must have been right above it. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so he figured that, like, if you found, if the world was spherical, which they believed at that time, that if you measured in another well with a stick pointing straight up on the summer solstice, that there would be some deviation in the shadow of the stick. Because in Syene, it should be pointing right down, there'd be no shadow. But anywhere else, there should be a shadow. And then you could measure at high noon, which even then they could pretty much figure out. You could figure out what the deviation in the number of degrees was in the shadow. And then if you knew the difference between Syene and this other place, which turned out to be Alexandria, you could then calculate the circumference of the Earth, which he did. Ooh. And so the sort of interesting thing about this is they didn't have rulers to sort of measure physical distance between these two cities, which were quite some distance away from, hundreds of miles away from each other. And so he did it using these guys called bemetists, who were architectural experts who had been trained to walk in a stereotypical fashion such that each stride was identical. Oh. And he had them measure the distance between Alexandria and Syene, and thereby calculated the circumference of the Earth to be 250,000 stadia. Now, we don't really know what a stadia was.
I do not.
We don't have like a stadia rule book, but so there's some argument about how long how big a stadia was, but based on the estimates of what a stadia probably was, the circumference of the Earth was between 24,000 and 29,000 miles, which is pretty darn close because the actual circumference is 24,900. So he really actually kind of nailed it using a stick stabbed into the ground and applying basic geometry principles. And I thought that is like, good on you, Eratosthenes.
That is, and this guy was called Beta?
He was called Beta, but I mean, I think that's an alpha right
That's
there.
An alpha move there, if ever I heard one.
So I was impressed.
Very cool indeed. All right, well, mine, I went back to the familiar well of one of our favorites, which is the BMJ Christmas edition. And I went to this year's BMJ Christmas edition, but I went to it for a reason this year, which is that the article that I'm going to talk about is entitled "The Time to Act is Now, a Pseudo-Systematic Review." And it was published by first author Nathan Ford, who is, in fact, somebody who I've worked with in the past, which now means I now know 2 people who have been published in the BMJ Christmas edition, which, as you know, is one of my lifelong goals. But this one I thought was really, really good in that, oftentimes articles in the BMJ's Christmas edition they're sort of really interesting and they come up with some kind of a funny idea. But the way they're written isn't always the cleverest or the funniest. This one has so many good lines in it. So the idea here is they say, "The time to act is now." This is a commonly used clarion call in medical journals. It can be found in titles of editorials, commentaries, letters, and occasionally original research. Nevertheless, we are concerned about the potentially endless stream of demands placed on health professionals around the world to act now without any obvious rationale and little regard for competing priorities, which, of course, Chris, you and I know, this does, in fact, appear often in medical journals.
How many emergencies can we tolerate?
Exactly. So they say, one of us had the idea years ago to undertake a review of papers that claimed the time for action is now. However, there never seemed to be a good time. Each time a new study got published claiming the time for something or other is now, there would be a brief increase in motivation, but this would soon fade. Finally, in May of 2020, with nowhere to go and little to do at the weekends, we decided it was time to act. So they searched for studies that made the claim, "The time is now," in the title. And then they said, "We were unsure whether authors only wanted people to act now or whether deferred action was also a desirable goal. We therefore undertook a sensitivity analysis that included the following statements. The time to act is later, and the time to act is in a bit." So they found... No, I'll get to that. So they found 595 titles, of which 512 were included for review. They then excluded 77 studies that used a question mark in the title. So the Time to act is now? ? Study selection was based on being able to access the full text free of charge version without having to bother logging into multiple journal sites using a friend's library access. I think that's a reasonable criteria the systematic review should use. And then we excluded one that asked, pediatric AIDS is now not the right time to act, because another group of clinicians had beaten them to it by asking exactly the same question a year before. This is like a very commonly used thing. So in the end, they found 50 studies that used an exclamation point, presumably because stating that the time to act is now was considered insufficient to express urgency. Claims about urgency varied by discipline, so the greatest number of papers making the claim were in oncology, which had 72 studies, surgery, which had 60 studies, and pediatrics, which had 33 studies. Pediatricians were also 5 times more likely than geriatricians to claim that the time to act is now, possibly reflecting how critical the passage of time is for children. And then they say we were unable to find any studies that claim the time to act is later, or the time to act is after a nap, or let's wait a bit. So they conclude the findings of our review suggest that it is always time to act. The claim that the time is now is rarely found in corrections. For example, when authors have had second thoughts about when to act. It is also never found in obituaries.
I suppose not. What about in the Journal of Shakespeareology? Would they?
Could be.
The time to act is now is generally true.
Could be.
That's so awesome. I love it.
I thought that was such a clever one, and the fact that it's done by some colleagues that I know makes me even happier.
You know, it occurs to me, Matt, thinking about systematic reviews, and my first rule of systematic reviews is never to do them.
Yes.
Because they're such a pain.
They take forever.
They take forever. And what takes forever is the asymptote, because there's always 5 or 6 papers in some obscure journal that your library doesn't subscribe to because it's a terrible journal. And you know that when you finally find the paper, it's going to have no influence on your systematic review or your meta-analysis whatsoever. And yet you feel obliged to do it. And I would love to do an analysis to see how many meta-analyses conclusions are in any way altered by the asymptotic papers that you pull in at the end.
Such a good question. Maybe we could
just say, let's stop doing that. It's just, what's the point?
Such a good question. I totally agree with you on that one. Totally agree.
Maybe next year in the Christmas edition.
Sounds good to me. All right. Well, that is the end of our program. If you got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthyX. You can tweet me at Prof. Matt Fox, or Chris at id.gill, or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound editing and having the best cat house in the business. And by cat house, I want to be clear, I do mean a house for his cats.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed it, and we hope you download our next episode.
Bye, everybody.